Imagine stepping into a grand cathedral. Sunlight streaming through towering stained glass windows. The echo of solemn hymns filling the air. And the scent of incense wrapping around you. It is easy to be swept away by the serenity, the sense of timeless wisdom, and the promise of moral guidance that the Catholic Church has offered for centuries. Many see it as a sanctuary, a place where faith, hope, and compassion intersect. Yet beneath the grandeur and the prayers lies a history far more complex, one that challenges the very ideals the Church has long championed. Throughout history, the Church has been revered for its spiritual leadership, its charitable missions, and its role in shaping moral frameworks across societies. But the same institution that preached love, compassion, and human dignity was also entangled in one of humanity's most painful chapters: slavery. The story of how faith and morality intersected with economic and social power is not just a footnote in history, it is a story of contradiction, moral compromise, and the long-lasting consequences of silence. From the 15th century onward, the transatlantic slave trade reshaped the world. Millions of Africans were torn from their homes, forced across the ocean in overcrowded ships under inhumane conditions, and sold into lifelong servitude in the Americas. The Church, far from universally condemning these practices, was at times directly involved. Papal bulls were issued that sanctioned the conquest of foreign lands and allowed the enslavement of those deemed non-Christian. Clergy and missionaries often accompanied expeditions, sometimes providing spiritual guidance to the enslavers rather than protection to the enslaved. Entire communities were affected, and the moral authority of religion was often wielded to justify exploitation. It is essential to recognize the complexity of this history. Not every member of the Church supported slavery. Dissenting voices did exist, calling for compassion and justice. Yet for centuries, the overwhelming silence, or worse, active participation, enabled the suffering of countless individuals. Understanding this history is not about casting blame for the sake of condemnation. It is about facing uncomfortable truths, acknowledging the past, and learning from it. History teaches us that institutions, no matter how venerable, are capable of both great good and profound harm depending on the choices of those who wield their power. In this video, we will explore this hidden history, examining the ways in which the Catholic Church was involved in slavery, how biblical texts were interpreted to justify oppression, and the long path toward moral reflection and reform. We will share real-life stories, highlight pivotal figures, and consider the lessons that remain relevant today. By shining a light on these difficult truths, we honor those whose lives were affected and challenge ourselves to uphold justice in our own time. If you are ready to uncover this untold story, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more eye-opening historical narratives. Stay with us until the end. You won't want to miss a single detail of this forbidden tale. As we continue our journey into this hidden history, it becomes impossible to ignore the staggering human toll of the transatlantic slave trade, a chapter that casts a long and painful shadow over centuries of global history. From the 15th to the 19th centuries, between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly torn from their homes, communities, and the familiar rhythms of daily life, thrust into a world that stripped them of dignity, identity, and freedom. The journey across the Atlantic, known historically as the Middle Passage, was nothing short of horrific. Overcrowded ships heaved with people packed so tightly that movement was nearly impossible. Air was thick and suffocating, and disease and despair swept through the holds unchecked. Many did not survive the voyage, their lives extinguished by conditions so cruel that the sheer scale of loss defies comprehension, leaving behind voids that families and entire communities would never recover from. For those who did reach the Americas, survival did not bring safety or respite, but rather entry into a system that reduced human beings to property, a mechanism of labor and extraction designed to benefit colonial powers while erasing the very essence of humanity from those who were enslaved. This era of forced migration and enslavement did not occur in a vacuum. It was intimately intertwined with economic ambition, imperial expansion, and societal structures that rationalized inequality. Plantations stretched across the Caribbean islands and the American South, fields heavy with sugar cane, tobacco, and cotton relied entirely on the labor of enslaved Africans, whose hands cultivated the wealth that would build nations while their voices, stories, and sufferings were systematically silenced. The Church, far from standing as a moral counterpoint to these practices, was at times complicit, its leaders issuing pronouncements and providing theological frameworks that were used to justify the ownership of human beings. Papal bulls, such as Dum Diversis and Inter Caetera, sanctioned conquest and conversion, granting legal and spiritual cover for the seizure of lands and the consignment of their inhabitants to bondage, a chilling example of how faith could be wielded as a tool to entrench suffering. Within this context, it becomes clear that the Middle Passage was not merely a logistical operation of transportation, but a moral rupture, a point at which human compassion was subordinated to commerce, and the sacredness of life was subordinated to the profit of empire. Within these harrowing circumstances, stories of resilience and resistance emerged. Though often buried beneath the weight of historical erasure, enslaved individuals found ways to maintain bonds with family members when possible, to preserve languages, traditions, and cultural identities, and to assert their agency in small but meaningful acts of defiance. Even as the overwhelming systems around them sought to crush their spirits, women and men labored under back-breaking conditions, yet managed to weave community networks, passing down stories and songs that carried both sorrow and hope. These human narratives, largely unrecorded in the official accounts of colonial powers, are vital for understanding the full human impact of the transatlantic slave trade. They remind us that beyond numbers and dates, the Middle Passage was a crucible in which both suffering and endurance were intensified, a period where the loss of life was immense, but where the human will to survive and assert dignity never fully disappeared. The Church's involvement added a particularly complex layer to this narrative, as religious authority was often invoked to provide moral cover for what was otherwise an indefensible enterprise. Selective readings of biblical texts, whether in the form of the Curse of Ham or interpretations of Pauline letters, were cited to rationalize enslavement, creating a veneer of divine sanction for practices that were rooted in economic exploitation and racial hierarchy. Missionaries accompanied expeditions, not merely to provide spiritual guidance to the enslavers, but to participate in the administration of these institutions of labor, an involvement that underscores the intersection of power, theology, and commerce. Even within European societies, the wealth generated by plantations, trade, and the sale of human beings flowed into churches, funding cathedrals, charitable endeavors, and institutions whose moral authority was paradoxically tied to the suffering of millions. Understanding this interconnectedness is essential to comprehending how the trade persisted for centuries with only pockets of resistance, as the structures of society, religious, economic, and political, mutually reinforced each other in sustaining slavery. The psychological and cultural toll was as profound as the physical suffering. Generations were born into servitude, never knowing the lands of their ancestors or the freedom that had been denied to them. Families were fragmented as children. Parents and spouses were sold to different owners, sometimes never to reunite. The trauma reverberated through communities, altering social structures, creating cycles of loss and displacement, and embedding inequality into the very fabric of societies built upon slavery. Yet amidst this darkness, the human capacity for memory, faith, and moral reflection persisted. Some members of the clergy and religious communities began to question the morality of these practices, sowing the seeds for later movements of abolition and reform. voices emerged that recognized the incompatibility of Christian teachings of love and compassion with the systematic dehumanization inherent in slavery. And slowly, over decades and centuries, these moral reckonings began to challenge entrenched economic and political interests. By connecting these historical realities to the larger narrative of human resilience, we see that the Middle Passage was not simply a logistical or economic phenomenon. It was a crucible of morality, faith, and endurance. It shaped the trajectory of nations, the lives of countless individuals, and the moral conscience of institutions like the Church, whose complicity and eventual confrontation with these truths continue to resonate today. Understanding the scale, brutality, and human consequences of this forced migration helps us grapple with the complexities of history, emphasizing that the story of slavery is inseparable from the story of human endurance, moral compromise, and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. As we delve deeper into this history, it is crucial to bear witness to these experiences, to reflect on the moral lessons they impart, and to honor the strength and resilience of those whose lives were forever altered by the Middle Passage, ensuring that their stories are neither forgotten nor diminished. As the vast transatlantic slave trade unfolded, it was not merely driven by commerce and conquest. It was also sanctioned and legitimized by the weight of spiritual authority, most notably through papal pronouncements that provided moral and legal cover for what would become one of history's darkest enterprises. Among the most significant of these documents were papal bulls such as Dum Diversas and Inter Caetera, which, far from being abstract theological statements, carried profound and tangible consequences for millions of people across continents. Issued in the 15th century, these bulls authorized European monarchs, particularly those of Portugal and Spain, to subdue and enslave non-Christian populations in Africa and the newly encountered Americas, framing conquest and subjugation as not only politically expedient but divinely sanctioned. The language of these decrees invoked the authority of the Church, portraying the expansion of European dominion and the capture of foreign peoples as part of a sacred mission, thereby entwining religious legitimacy with imperial ambition in a way that made opposition morally fraught and socially perilous. The issuance of these bulls must be understood against the backdrop of a Europe eager to extend its influence, both economically and culturally, into uncharted territories. Monarchs were motivated not simply by the desire for wealth but also by the imperative to spread Christianity, an aspiration that was itself morally and politically compelling in the context of the era. The papal bulls functioned as instruments that merged these motivations, providing explicit permission for conquest while embedding a theological rationale that made resistance appear tantamount to defiance against divine authority. By endorsing the seizure and enslavement of non-Christian populations, the Church effectively sanctioned the removal of entire communities from their homelands, legitimizing the use of force, coercion, and the systemic exploitation of human labor. This intertwining of spiritual and secular power created a framework in which slavery could be conducted with a veneer of righteousness, and colonial powers could advance their economic interests under the banner of divine approval. Within this framework, the European powers moved with both urgency and confidence. Ships set sail from Portuguese and Spanish ports laden not only with goods for trade, but with the intent to capture human lives, fueled by the knowledge that their actions had the explicit backing of Rome. Chaplains and missionaries often accompanied these expeditions, not merely as observers or spiritual guides but as participants in a system that would reshape the lives of millions. The bulls provided a theological lens through which the violent subjugation of entire populations could be rationalized, turning acts of brutality into expressions of duty and obedience. The connection between papal authority and colonial enterprise reinforced the idea that European expansion and the establishment of plantation economies were part of a moral and historical imperative, effectively blurring the line between divine will and human ambition. This sanctioning of conquest and enslavement did not exist in isolation, but was intricately connected to the broader machinery of the transatlantic slave trade. Africans were forcibly captured or purchased, transported under unimaginable conditions across the Middle Passage, and sold into labor systems that underpinned the wealth of European colonies in the Americas. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other commodities became the tangible rewards of a process steeped in both material gain and religious justification, illustrating how the papal bulls were not mere symbolic gestures but catalysts that had concrete and devastating effects on the lives of millions. Families were torn apart, cultural identities disrupted, and communities decimated, all under the pretext of spiritual authority and the expansion of Christendom. The interplay of theology and commerce, faith and exploitation, created a moral dissonance that would resonate through centuries, highlighting the complexities of human behavior when moral authority is wielded to serve economic ends. Yet, even amidst the complicity of religious and secular powers, there were instances of moral reflection and dissent. Though these voices were often marginalized, some missionaries and clergy struggled privately with the brutality they witnessed, questioning whether the pursuit of religious and political goals could ever justify the suffering imposed on entire populations. However, the overwhelming institutional endorsement of conquest and enslavement, reinforced by papal authority, created a social and cultural environment in which dissent was difficult, dangerous, or entirely suppressed. The bulls, in effect, codified a system in which European ambition could flourish at the expense of the enslaved, illustrating how the intersection of religion and politics can be mobilized to legitimize systemic oppression. The long-term impact of these papal endorsements cannot be overstated. By intertwining divine authority with the mechanics of slavery, they provided a historical precedent for the moral rationalizations that persisted for centuries. Clergy and laypeople alike drew upon these decrees to defend the institution of slavery, citing scriptural interpretations and papal sanction as proof that subjugation was not only permissible but divinely ordained. In doing, the bulls contributed to a cultural and theological narrative that normalized the dehumanization of millions, creating obstacles to reform and prolonging the suffering endured by enslaved individuals and their descendants. The legacy of this period is visible not only in the historical records of colonization and trade, but in the lingering moral and social questions about authority, complicity, and the ethical responsibilities of institutions entrusted with spiritual guidance. By tracing the trajectory from the issuance of dum diversis and inter caetera through the implementation of slavery and colonial expansion, we see how the authority of the Church became inseparably linked with the machinery of exploitation, illustrating the profound consequences when moral and spiritual legitimacy is mobilized to support economic and political ambition. These documents, at once legal instruments and theological pronouncements, exemplify the ways in which human suffering can be rationalized under the guise of higher purpose, leaving a legacy that challenges us to critically examine the interplay between faith, power, and morality. As we continue to explore this chapter of history, it becomes clear that the story of the papal bulls is not just about documents or decrees, but about the lives irrevocably shaped by decisions made in the halls of power, reminding us that understanding history requires not only knowing what was done but grasping how and why it was justified, and the lessons it offers for ethical reflection today. As the transatlantic slave trade surged across continents, it was not only merchants, explorers, and colonial authorities who played roles in its expansion. Religious figures, missionaries, chaplains, and prominent spiritual leaders were deeply entangled in the machinery of slavery, their presence both a witness to and, at times, an instrument of human suffering. These men and women of faith, who preached morality, salvation, and compassion, often stood in the shadows of the horrors inflicted upon enslaved Africans, navigating a tension between spiritual duty and the social, political, and economic systems that surrounded them. Among the most striking examples was George Whitefield, a towering figure in the 18th century evangelical movement whose sermons drew tens of thousands of listeners across Great Britain and the American colonies, and whose reputation as a man of faith and moral authority was widely celebrated. Yet behind this public image was a complex and troubling reality. Whitefield actively advocated for the legalization of slavery in the colony of Georgia, arguing that the prosperity of both the land and the charitable institutions he supported depended upon the labor of enslaved Africans. Whitefield's involvement illustrates the extraordinary moral contradictions of the era, where religious justification, personal ambition, and economic necessity converged in ways that challenged the very tenets of Christian ethics. The Bethesda Orphanage, which Whitefield founded and sought to fund, became an institution whose financial survival was intertwined with the ownership of enslaved people. He reasoned that the prohibition of slavery in Georgia hindered the colony's economic development, a logic that ultimately led him to campaign for changes in colonial law to permit the importation and enslavement of African people. Whitefield's actions were not simply theoretical or distant. He directly purchased enslaved individuals to work on his orphanage's property, effectively intertwining his philanthropic goals with the exploitation of human lives. This pragmatic, yet morally fraught, approach exemplifies how religious authority could be mobilized to justify systemic injustice, turning spiritual leadership into a tool that both sanctioned and benefited from oppression. Missionaries and chaplains accompanying European expeditions to Africa and the Americas faced daily exposure to the cruelty and dehumanization inherent in the trade, often serving as spiritual guides for those responsible for enforcing bondage rather than protecting the enslaved. These figures bore witness to the shackled bodies, the cries of mothers separated from children, and the relentless labor demanded on plantations. And yet, their proximity to power and the institutional imperatives of the church often muted objection or dissent. In some cases, religious leaders rationalized their participation by framing slavery as a necessary condition for the propagation of Christianity, presenting the forced conversion of enslaved Africans as a higher moral purpose that, in their view, offset the immediate suffering inflicted upon them. Such reasoning, however, was deeply flawed, masking the human cost of the institution and normalizing the exploitation of entire populations under the guise of spiritual duty. The case of Whitefield is particularly illustrative of the wider trend among prominent Christian leaders who actively engaged with and defended slavery. Figures such as James Habersham, who collaborated with Whitefield in Georgia, and later inheritors of his estates, like Selina Hastings, continued the practice of owning enslaved Africans to maintain the financial viability of religious and charitable projects. These patterns reveal how deeply the institution of slavery penetrated not only secular society but also the religious sphere, shaping policies, funding mechanisms, and the day-to-day operations of organizations that were otherwise celebrated for their moral and spiritual missions. The ethical dissonance inherent in this situation highlights the dangers of uncritically conflating religious authority with moral righteousness, and it underscores the complexity of historical narratives where revered individuals simultaneously championed faith and perpetuated oppression. Beyond individual actors, the systemic support provided by religious institutions reinforced the normalization of slavery. Catholic, Anglican, and Protestant communities often benefited economically from enslaved labor, either directly through property ownership or indirectly through donations, tithers, and institutional funding sourced from the profits of plantations. Clergy rarely spoke out against the prevailing system, and when they did, their voices were frequently marginalized or silenced. The theological justifications they offered selective interpretations of biblical passages, appeals to divine will, and the notion of civilizing or converting enslaved peoples created a moral framework in which slavery was not only tolerated but seen as a sanctioned element of social and spiritual order. This duality, between spiritual preaching and material complicity, amplified the suffering endured by millions while allowing institutions of faith to maintain authority and credibility in the eyes of society. Even as the 18th century progressed, dissenting voices emerged within and outside these religious communities, challenging the morality of slavery and advocating for reform. However, these voices were often isolated, confronting entrenched economic and political interests that were reinforced by centuries of theological and cultural precedent. The silence or complicity of the majority of religious leaders had enduring consequences, legitimizing practices that inflicted generational trauma and embedding systemic inequality into the fabric of both European and American societies. Understanding the involvement of figures like Whitefield and the broader religious apparatus provides a more nuanced view of history, illustrating that spiritual leadership is not inherently immune to moral compromise, especially when intertwined with material gain and social authority. The story of religious leaders in the context of slavery reminds us that history is seldom black and white, that moral authority can be misapplied, and that the ethical responsibilities of faith communities are inseparable from the human consequences of their actions. By exploring these complex realities, we gain insight into the mechanisms through which oppression was justified, how individuals and institutions navigated ethical dilemmas, and the enduring lessons about accountability, conscience, and the need to confront injustice wherever it exists. It is a narrative that forces us to grapple with uncomfortable truths, not to diminish faith itself, but to illuminate the human capacity for both moral failure and reflection, and to recognize the profound responsibility that comes with power, influence, and the stewardship of belief. Throughout the long and painful history of slavery, one of the most troubling mechanisms of justification lay in the selective interpretation of sacred texts, which were wielded by religious leaders and colonial authorities to legitimize the subjugation of millions of Africans. From the Old Testament to the New, passages such as Leviticus 25, the story of the curse of Ham in Genesis, and the letters of Paul in the epistles were extracted from their historical and theological contexts, transformed into instruments that sanctioned ownership, control, and exploitation. Leviticus 25, which lays out regulations for slavery within the Israelite community, was interpreted by some European and American theologians as an endorsement of perpetual servitude, detached from its original context of temporary servitude among a specific cultural and legal community. This reinterpretation allowed enslavers and their supporters to cloak economic ambition and racial prejudice in a veneer of divine legitimacy, suggesting that the ownership of African people was not merely lawful but divinely sanctioned, and that resistance to such practices would amount to disobedience against a higher moral order. The story of the curse of Ham, found in Genesis, became another cornerstone in the ideological scaffolding used to justify racialized slavery. According to the narrative, Noah cursed Ham's son, Canaan, declaring that he and his descendants would be servants of servants to their kin. Over centuries, this story was misappropriated by European theologians and colonial powers to create a pseudo-biblical rationale for the enslavement of African peoples, despite the lack of textual or historical evidence linking Ham's lineage to the entire continent of Africa. This distortion of scripture became a convenient tool to rationalize a social and economic system that relied entirely on the labor of people forcibly removed from their homes and denied the basic rights and dignities afforded to others. The Curse of Ham narrative was widely circulated and invoked in sermons, pamphlets, and legal arguments, embedding itself deeply into the moral consciousness of societies that benefited from slavery, and creating a cultural and religious justification that would persist for generations. Equally influential were interpretations of the Pauline epistles in the New Testament, where passages instructing slaves to obey their masters were lifted from their original context and weaponized to suppress dissent and justify bondage. Letters such as Ephesians 6:5, which encourages slaves to obey earthly masters with respect and fear, were recast as divine endorsement of the hierarchical and exploitative systems of plantation economies. These interpretations ignored the broader moral and ethical teachings of Paul and the New Testament, focusing narrowly on obedience and subservience to maintain the social order. By framing enslavement as divinely sanctioned, slaveholders and religious authorities created an environment in which cruelty, dehumanization, and exploitation were not only tolerated but normalized, fostering an entire worldview in which Africans were seen as inherently suited for subjugation, a notion that contradicted the fundamental principles of justice, compassion, and human equality that undergirded much of Christian teaching. The theological rationalizations were not abstract or distant. They shaped the policies, laws, and daily practices of societies built upon the institution of slavery. Clergy often provided spiritual counsel to enslavers, affirming that their ownership of human beings was consistent with scripture and moral law. Religious leaders wrote treatises, delivered sermons, and counseled political authorities, reinforcing the belief that slavery was a natural and ordained part of the social fabric. Even in colonies and emerging nations where legal codes were contested, the moral weight of biblical authority lent legitimacy to the dehumanization and exploitation of African people, embedding racism into both cultural and religious consciousness. The careful selection and misapplication of scripture thus became a powerful tool, shaping attitudes, justifying economic systems, and silencing dissent. At the same time, these biblical interpretations reveal a profound moral tension within the Christian tradition. The same scriptures that were invoked to justify enslavement also contain principles of justice, compassion, and the inherent dignity of every human being, creating a stark contrast between selective interpretation and the broader ethical imperatives of faith. Throughout the centuries, this tension provoked debate, reflection, and, ultimately, the moral awakenings that would fuel abolitionist movements. By examining how Leviticus, Genesis, and the Pauline epistles were used to sanction slavery, we see how religious authority can be mobilized to serve economic and political ends, demonstrating the dangers of isolating texts from context and of using sacred teachings to reinforce systemic injustice. The long-term effects of these theological justifications were devastating, contributing to the persistence of slavery, the entrenchment of racial hierarchies, and the intergenerational trauma experienced by African communities. Entire societies were structured around the notion that ownership of human beings was morally permissible, a perception reinforced through religious instruction, civic law, and social custom. Families were fragmented, languages and cultures were suppressed, and the social fabric of African and African-descended communities was irreversibly altered. Yet, even amid this systemic exploitation, enslaved people found ways to resist, adapt, and preserve cultural identities, challenging the moral and theological narratives imposed upon them, and reminding the world of the resilience of human spirit in the face of institutionalized injustice. Understanding the selective interpretation of Scripture in support of slavery is crucial for grasping the broader historical narrative of moral compromise and complicity. It forces reflection on the power of ideology, the role of institutions in shaping human behavior, and the consequences of aligning spiritual authority with economic and political gain. It also illuminates the pathways through which later movements of moral reflection and abolition emerged. As thinkers, preachers, and activists began to challenge the very interpretations that had once legitimized bondage. By tracing these threads, we recognize that the misuse of sacred texts was not merely a theological error, but a deliberate instrument of social control, one that shaped history in profound ways, and whose legacy continues to inform contemporary discussions of justice, equality, and human dignity. The story of Leviticus, the curse of Ham, and Pauline letters in the context of slavery is therefore more than a historical footnote. It is a testament to the intersection of belief, power, and exploitation, and a reminder of the ethical vigilance required to prevent moral authority from being misappropriated. It teaches that faith, when divorced from compassion and justice, can be weaponized, but also that reflection, critique, and conscience can restore a measure of humanity to even the most entrenched systems of oppression, offering lessons that resonate far beyond the centuries of bondage in which these interpretations were employed. As the centuries of the transatlantic slave trade unfolded, one of the most profound contradictions of the era lay in the intersection of faith, morality, and material wealth, particularly within the Catholic Church and other Christian institutions that were deeply enmeshed in the economic structures of slavery. While the Church preached compassion, charity, and the spiritual equality of all souls, it simultaneously benefited in tangible and substantial ways from the labor of enslaved Africans, creating a moral tension that would resonate across generations. Monasteries, convents, and religious schools often relied on donations and grants derived from plantations worked by enslaved people, while the Church itself sometimes directly owned such estates. These holdings were not incidental. They represented a significant source of income that supported the maintenance of cathedrals, funded charitable activities, and financed educational institutions, thereby embedding the institution of slavery into the very fabric of ecclesiastical life. The financial entanglement of the Church with slavery was complex, reflecting both deliberate acquisition and passive acceptance. In the American colonies, for example, the Jesuit order maintained extensive plantations in Maryland, cultivating tobacco and other cash crops with the labor of enslaved Africans. The profits generated by these plantations were used to fund schools, churches, and missions, creating a system in which spiritual and material objectives were inseparably intertwined. The Jesuits did eventually sell some of their enslaved workers in the 19th century, but not before centuries of wealth accumulation and institutional expansion had been built on their labor. Similarly, other Catholic institutions in Europe and the Americas benefited from donations and bequests that were made possible by enslaved labor, whether through direct ownership of plantations, indirect investment in colonial ventures, or the receipt of tithe and tribute from slave-holding parishioners. The moral dissonance of these arrangements was rarely confronted by church authorities at the time, who often rationalized their actions through selective interpretations of Scripture. Historical precedent, and the social norms of their day. This financial complicity highlights the broader societal structures that made slavery both sustainable and socially acceptable. Religious institutions were not isolated from the economic realities of the colonies. They were integral participants. Clergy, monks, and nuns often engaged with the logistical and administrative aspects of plantation management, from overseeing labor assignments to ensuring the maintenance of infrastructure, thereby translating moral authority into practical oversight of human exploitation. The intertwining of wealth and faith created a situation in which the institution of the Church could prosper materially while simultaneously failing to advocate for the liberation of those it profited from, revealing a stark divergence between ethical teaching and lived practice. Even when theological debates arose regarding the immorality of slavery, these discussions were often muted by the undeniable financial incentives that underpinned the institution's operations. The accumulation of wealth through slave labor was not limited to distant plantations. It permeated everyday life within religious communities. Donations from wealthy parishioners who themselves profited from enslaved labor contributed to the construction of churches, the maintenance of orphanages, and the sustenance of monastic orders. These financial flows created a cycle of dependency, wherein the prosperity of the Church and its programs was tied to the continuation of slavery. In essence, the Church's material success became inseparable from the subjugation of African people, and the spiritual authority it wielded was, in part, sustained by a system that inflicted profound suffering. This dynamic illustrates the powerful ways in which economic incentives can compromise moral integrity. especially when institutions possess significant social, spiritual, and political influence. The tension between moral teaching and material gain also had lasting implications for the Church's public image and historical legacy. While some leaders spoke out against slavery and advocated for reform, their voices were often overshadowed by the institutional inertia created by centuries of financial entanglement. Abolitionist movements frequently encountered resistance not only from secular authorities, but also from religious leaders who feared that challenging slavery would destabilize their economic and social foundations. The reluctance of church institutions to confront the immorality of slavery, despite possessing theological and moral justification to do so, reinforced a social environment in which oppression was normalized and systemic inequities were perpetuated. Moreover, the financial benefits accrued from slavery extended beyond mere wealth accumulation. They shaped the institutional priorities and internal politics of the Church. Decisions regarding staffing, resource allocation, and program development were often influenced by the economic considerations tied to enslaved labor. Religious orders, faced with the realities of funding expansive operations, made choices that prioritized institutional sustainability over ethical consistency, demonstrating the pervasive influence of economic dependency on moral decision-making. These choices reverberated through generations, affecting how church resources were distributed, how clergy engaged with communities, and how theological discourse evolved in relation to social justice issues. This historical entanglement serves as a critical lens for examining the broader consequences of slavery and the responsibilities of faith-based institutions in society. By analyzing the ways in which the Church benefited materially from the exploitation of human beings, we gain insight into the complex interplay between economic interest and ethical obligation, and the dangers inherent in allowing financial considerations to override moral imperatives. The narrative also illuminates the resilience of enslaved communities, whose labor sustained institutions that often failed to protect their dignity, reminding us that wealth and power built on injustice carry enduring moral consequences. Ultimately, the Church's financial entanglement with slavery underscores a profound lesson about accountability, moral vigilance, and the importance of aligning principles with practice. It demonstrates that spiritual authority, when coupled with material interests, can become complicit in systemic harm, and that institutional prosperity achieved at the expense of human rights demands critical reflection. By confronting this uncomfortable history, we can better understand the intersections of faith, economics, and ethics, and recognize the ongoing responsibility of religious and social institutions to pursue justice, equality, and the protection of human dignity in all aspects of their work. This historical reflection reminds us that moral courage requires both speech and action, particularly when power, influence, and material benefit intersect with the lives of the vulnerable. Amid the centuries-long entanglement of the Church with slavery, another subtle yet powerful force shaped the institution's response. The pervasive fear of social unrest and the destabilization of societies built upon the labor of enslaved people. Religious leaders, acutely aware of their position as moral authorities and social mediators, often found themselves walking a precarious line between spiritual responsibility and the practical realities of social cohesion, aligned, all too frequently, tipped in favor of inaction. In communities where economies were entirely dependent on enslaved labor, any vocal opposition to slavery threatened not only the social order but also the material security of the very institutions that clergy served, creating a disquieting conflict between ethical principles and pragmatic considerations. This fear was neither abstract nor hypothetical. The potential for violent upheaval, political backlash, and economic collapse was real, and many church authorities concluded that silence, or at most cautious commentary, was safer than confrontation, even in the face of overwhelming moral evidence that slavery was fundamentally unjust. In the southern United States, For instance, the Church operated within an intricate web of societal hierarchies, legal codes, and entrenched economic systems that depended entirely on the forced labor of African people. Clergy were often intimately connected to the local elite, who owned plantations and wielded influence over municipal and regional governance. Publicly condemning slavery risked alienating parishioners, provoking local authorities, and even inviting violence against the church itself. This created an environment in which theological reflection and moral critique were subordinated to the imperatives of survival and social stability. For some leaders, the calculation was simple. Challenging slavery could bring immediate danger to both congregants and clergy, while tacit acceptance or cautious neutrality offered safety, continuity, and a semblance of order, even as it perpetuated suffering on a massive scale. The tension between ethical duty and fear of destabilization manifested across denominational lines, affecting Protestants and Catholics alike. In the early 19th century, disputes over slavery fractured American denominations, giving rise to distinct northern and southern branches of Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians. Southern clergy frequently emphasized the necessity of maintaining social harmony, framing opposition to slavery as a threat to peace, security, and even divine order. Northern religious leaders, by contrast, increasingly interpreted Scripture through an abolitionist lens, arguing that moral responsibility outweighed concerns about social disruption. These divisions illuminate the broader moral calculus at play. While some were willing to risk personal safety and social stability to challenge systemic injustice, many others prioritized the preservation of social structures, even when those structures relied on profound human suffering. The fear of social unrest was often intertwined with economic anxiety, as enslaved labor constituted the backbone of regional wealth and productivity. Clergy recognized that confronting slavery could destabilize local economies, erode tithes and donations, and imperil the financial viability of churches, schools, and charitable institutions. This created a paradox in which the church's very capacity to serve the community, its ability to educate, provide charity, and maintain religious infrastructure was perceived to be at odds with moral action. Leaders rationalized inaction by framing the issue as a matter of prudence. Social stability was necessary for the welfare of all. An immediate confrontation with slavery risked chaotic upheaval that could imperil both the oppressed and the wider community. In this context, ethical hesitation became institutionalized, and the church's silence was codified as a pragmatic, albeit morally fraught, strategy. Beyond the United States, similar dynamics unfolded across colonial empires where European powers relied heavily on enslaved labor in the Caribbean, South America, and Africa. Missionaries, chaplains, and clerical administrators witnessed the brutal realities of slavery firsthand. Yet many were constrained by the structural dependencies of colonial society. Open opposition to slavery could disrupt alliances with colonial authorities, jeopardize missionary operation, and undermine the influence of the church in these territories. Consequently, moral outrage was often muted by a pervasive fear that activism could trigger rebellion, compromise religious missions, or provoke punitive measures against clergy. The result was a troubling pattern of complicity through caution, in which awareness of injustice coexisted with institutional inaction, allowing slavery to continue largely unchallenged. This climate of fear also contributed to a selective engagement with Scripture, wherein passages that endorsed obedience, hierarchy, or social order were emphasized to justify the status quo, while broader ethical imperatives were downplayed. Clergy who feared societal destabilization leaned on theological arguments that stressed patience, divine providence, and social harmony, framing the endurance of slavery as a temporary or necessary condition within God's plan. In doing, they reinforced systems of oppression, providing a moral veneer for economic exploitation while suppressing alternative interpretations that might encourage abolition. This manipulation of moral authority demonstrates the potent interplay between fear, theology, and social power, showing how apprehension about unrest can shape the ethical choices of institutions and individuals alike. Yet, history also records that fear was not insurmountable. As abolitionist movements gained momentum in the late 18th and 19th centuries, many religious leaders began to confront the tension between social stability and moral duty. Figures such as William Wilberforce in England and Charles Finney in the United States exemplified the courage required to challenge entrenched systems, demonstrating that ethical action often necessitated risking both reputation and institutional security. Their efforts reveal that while fear constrained many clergy, it did not extinguish the moral imperative to act, and that institutional inertia can be overcome when conviction and advocacy intersect with broader social awareness. The Church's hesitation to confront slavery due to fear of social unrest undoes a vital lesson about the relationship between morality, power, and societal structure. It illustrates how ethical principles can be subordinated to pragmatic concerns, and how institutions may perpetuate injustice through caution, silence, or rationalization. By examining this historical pattern, we gain insight into the pressures that shape decision-making in contexts of systemic oppression, and the enduring importance of moral courage in challenging entrenched inequities. It reminds us that genuine leadership, whether spiritual, political, or social, demands confronting injustice even when such action threatens stability or challenges deeply rooted economic and cultural norms, affirming that ethical responsibility cannot be deferred without consequence. In the United States, the history of Catholic institutions during the era of slavery presents a stark illustration of the tension between moral doctrine and institutional practice, revealing a complex and often troubling dynamic in which ethical principles were subordinated to economic interests and social expediency. Among the most prominent examples were the Jesuits, who established extensive plantations in Maryland and other colonies, relying on enslaved Africans to cultivate tobacco, corn, and other cash crops that provided substantial revenue for their educational and religious missions. These plantations were not peripheral endeavors. They were central to the financial stability of Jesuit colleges, churches, and missions, creating a direct and inescapable link between human bondage and institutional prosperity. The labor of enslaved individuals enabled the construction of churches, the funding of schools, and the expansion of charitable operations, embedding slavery into the very infrastructure of Catholic life in America. Yet, despite the Church's professed commitment to compassion, justice, and the dignity of every human soul, public opposition to slavery from Catholic authorities was minimal, revealing a profound silence that spoke volumes about the Church's complicity. This silence was multifaceted. On one level, it reflected the broader societal context in which Catholic communities existed. Many congregants, particularly in southern states like Maryland and Louisiana, were themselves slaveholders, and the Church depended on their donations, participation, and loyalty to sustain its operations. Criticizing slavery risked alienating influential parishioners and destabilizing financial support, creating a climate in which moral critique was tempered by practical necessity. Clergy were acutely aware of the potential repercussions of openly opposing slavery. Protests, reduced contributions, social ostracism, and even violence were genuine concerns. In this environment, the Church's inaction can be understood not as a lack of awareness, but as a strategic decision to preserve institutional stability, though one that came at the immense cost of human suffering and ethical integrity. The Jesuits' involvement in slavery was both direct and meticulously organized. They maintained records of enslaved individuals, monitored their labor, and managed the sale and transfer of enslaved people when necessary to support institutional finances. These actions were framed as administrative necessities, but they underscore the normalization of slavery within the Church's operational framework, even as debates over abolition gained traction in the broader society. Jesuit institutions largely remained silent, acting in ways that preserved their economic interests while deflecting moral scrutiny. The proceeds from enslaved labor helped fund the growth of schools such as Georgetown University, a historical reality that intertwines educational achievement with human exploitation, illustrating how moral compromise can be institutionalized over generations. This pattern of silence was not limited to the Jesuits. Across the United States, other Catholic dioceses and orders exhibited similar behavior, owning enslaved individuals or benefiting indirectly from slave labor while refraining from public advocacy for abolition. The Archbishop of Baltimore, John Carroll, is a notable example. While he personally owned a small number of enslaved individuals, he never took a public stance against the institution of slavery, reflecting a broader reluctance among Catholic leaders to confront the moral contradictions inherent in their practices. The institutional reticence was reinforced by theological rationalizations that emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and the purported inevitability of social structures, allowing church authorities to reconcile participation in slavery with their religious beliefs, even as they silently perpetuated systemic injustice. The consequences of this complicity extended beyond immediate material gain. By failing to challenge slavery, Catholic institutions lent moral legitimacy to an oppressive system, reinforcing societal norms that dehumanized African people and justified their exploitation. The absence of ecclesiastical opposition contributed to the entrenchment of slavery in legal, economic, and cultural frameworks, slowing the momentum of abolitionist efforts and prolonging the suffering of countless individuals. Clergy and religious orders that could have been voices for reform instead became part of a structural mechanism that normalized bondage, demonstrating how institutional silence can have far-reaching ethical ramifications. Yet, even amid this complicity, cracks began to emerge as moral consciousness evolved. By the mid-19th century, growing abolitionist sentiment among Catholics, coupled with the influence of Protestant reformers and social activists, began to challenge the status quo. Individuals within the Church started to question the alignment between doctrine and practice, advocating for the recognition of enslaved people's inherent dignity and the necessity of emancipation. These internal debates highlighted the tension between long-standing economic reliance on slavery and emerging ethical imperatives, illustrating the painful process of institutional self-reflection and the struggle to reconcile historical actions with evolving moral understanding. The historical record of Catholic institutions in the United States, particularly their ownership of enslaved people and their initial silence on abolition, offers a profound lesson about the interplay between power, economics, and morality. It demonstrates how even organizations founded on principles of justice, compassion, and human dignity can become entangled in systems of exploitation when financial interests and social pressures are prioritized over ethical responsibility. The legacy of this complicity continues to influence contemporary discussions about historical accountability, institutional reform, and the enduring impacts of slavery on American society. Ultimately, the silence and participation of Catholic institutions in slavery underscore the importance of moral courage, transparency, and proactive advocacy within religious and social organizations. They remind us that ethical integrity requires confronting injustice, even when doing so threatens financial stability or challenges deeply entrenched social norms. By examining this chapter of history with honesty and clarity, we can better understand the responsibilities of institutions to align their actions with their professed values, acknowledging past wrongs while striving to prevent similar complicity in the future. This reflection encourages contemporary faith communities and institutions to critically assess how economic and social pressures may shape moral choices, emphasizing that true moral leadership demands both courage and accountability. As the shadow of slavery stretched across continents and generations, a countercurrent of moral courage began to emerge from unexpected corners of the religious world. A force that would challenge the entrenched systems of exploitation and give voice to the oppressed. Evangelicals, Quakers, and reform-minded clergy recognized the stark dissonance between the teachings of love, justice, and human dignity and the brutal realities endured by millions of enslaved Africans. Their awakening was neither sudden nor simple. It was a gradual process, fueled by personal conviction, scriptural interpretation, and an unyielding sense of justice that transcended fear. Financial interest and social conformity. Among the most notable figures in this movement was William Wilberforce, a young member of the British Parliament who, inspired by his Christian faith, dedicated his life to the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. Wilberforce saw the moral blight of slavery not as a distant problem, but as a direct affront to divine justice, a stain on the conscience of society that could not be ignored. He labored tirelessly, navigating political opposition, social indifference, and personal doubt, believing that ethical responsibility demanded sustained action, even when immediate success seemed elusive. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, similar convictions animated reformers who were determined to confront the pervasive institution of slavery. John Wesley, founder of Methodism, had long condemned human bondage as a moral atrocity, emphasizing that the gospel's teachings demanded the recognition of the inherent worth and dignity of every individual. Wesley's writings and sermons circulated widely, laying the intellectual and spiritual groundwork for subsequent generations of abolitionists, illustrating how moral vision could bridge both time and geography, inspiring practical action that challenged deeply rooted societal norms. Equally influential were the narratives and advocacy of figures such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose seminal work Uncle Tom's Cabin translated abstract moral arguments into vivid storytelling that exposed the human suffering behind the statistics and economic calculations of slavery. Stowe's prose did not merely describe the institution. It humanized the enslaved, giving them voices, emotions, and aspirations, compelling readers to confront the ethical urgency of abolition with empathy and clarity. Her work demonstrates the power of narrative to awaken conscience and galvanize social movements, showing that advocacy for justice requires not only moral reasoning but also emotional resonance that can penetrate hearts and minds. Sojourner Truth, a former enslaved woman herself, added a profoundly personal dimension to the struggle. Her speeches and public appearances articulating the lived realities of bondage with unflinching honesty and moral authority. Her presence challenged audiences to reconcile their beliefs with the stark inequalities she endured, illustrating that the fight against slavery was not an abstract philosophical exercise, but a confrontation with tangible human suffering. Truth's courage exemplified the intersection of faith, moral clarity, and lived experience, highlighting the indispensable role of those directly affected in shaping movements for justice. The combined efforts of these reformers, parliamentarians, clergy, authors, and formerly enslaved advocates created a multifaceted campaign that addressed slavery on legal, social, and spiritual fronts. Leveraging persuasion, legislation, moral suasion, and storytelling to erode the legitimacy of an institution that had long been normalized and reinforced by powerful religious and political authorities. The work of these abolitionists also reveals the profound tension between institutional inertia and individual moral action. While established churches, including many Catholic and Protestant institutions, had long remained silent or even complicit, reform-minded individuals acted from the conviction that ethical principles must supersede tradition. Financial interest and fear of social unrest. Their activism demonstrates that moral courage often arises not from collective consensus but from the willingness of individuals and small communities to challenge the prevailing norms, to speak truth to power, and to insist that justice and humanity be prioritized over convenience and expediency. The effectiveness of these efforts was amplified by the strategic use of moral, religious, and emotional arguments, which penetrated both public consciousness and political institutions, creating the conditions for legislative and societal transformation. In the United Kingdom, Wilberforce's tireless campaigning, in alliance with Quakers and other reformers, eventually led to the passage of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, a landmark legal achievement that ended the British transatlantic slave trade. Though not slavery itself, this legislative milestone demonstrates how sustained advocacy, rooted in moral conviction and bolstered by strategic alliances, can yield tangible outcomes, even against formidable resistance from entrenched interests. In the United States, evangelical leaders, inspired by similar ethical imperatives, mobilized communities, published pamphlets, and organized societies that raised awareness, lobbied for legal reforms, and provided tangible support to those escaping bondage, illustrating that the moral arc of history bends through persistent, collective effort informed by principle and compassion. Women played a particularly critical role in this movement, with figures like Harriet Beecher Stowe exemplifying the capacity of literature and moral persuasion to affect widespread consciousness. Sojourner Truth and other female activists challenged both racial and gender hierarchies, emphasizing the interconnectedness of human rights and the necessity of inclusive advocacy. These contributions underscore that effective movements against entrenched injustice require diverse voices and perspectives, particularly those who have lived experience of oppression, capable of articulating the stakes of moral failure in a society still grappling with complicity and silence. The anti-slavery campaigns led by evangelicals, Quakers, and reform-minded clergy offer enduring lessons about the interplay between faith, moral courage, and social activism. They show that confronting systemic injustice demands more than awareness. It requires deliberate action, strategic planning, and the willingness to risk social, political, and personal consequences in pursuit of ethical imperatives. By examining the lives and work of Wilberforce, Wesley, Stowe, Truth, and countless unnamed advocates, we observe how principled individuals can disrupt the normalization of oppression, inspire widespread moral awakening, and effect lasting change, transforming societies in accordance with the highest ideals of justice and human dignity. Ultimately, their efforts remind us that faith and ethics are not passive attributes but catalysts for action, capable of challenging institutions, reshaping societal norms, and restoring the humanity that centuries of exploitation sought to erase. By connecting their advocacy to the historical complicity of institutions like the Catholic Church, we see both the failures and the triumphs of moral engagement, highlighting the enduring importance of courage, vision, and unyielding commitment to justice in confronting systemic oppression and advancing the cause of human freedom. As the 19th century unfolded, the moral conscience of the Church began to stir, long after centuries of complicity in an institution that had caused immeasurable suffering and injustice. The eventual condemnation of slavery by the Catholic Church, culminating in papal pronouncements that denounced the slave trade and human bondage, marked a significant, albeit delayed, acknowledgement of wrongdoing. This formal stance, however, cannot erase the historical reality that the Church had, for generations, been silent, complicit, and in some cases actively engaged in supporting the exploitation of human beings for economic and political gain. Yet, this delayed recognition also demonstrates the profound capacity for moral awakening, a recognition that even deeply entrenched institutions, capable of sustaining practices contrary to their own ethical teachings, can eventually confront past errors and assert a vision of justice more aligned with the principles they profess. The Church's transformation in thought and action did not occur in isolation. It was the result of persistent pressure from abolitionists, reformers, and ordinary believers who insisted that faith demanded adherence to the most fundamental human values: dignity, compassion, and equity. Figures such as William Wilberforce, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Sojourner Truth, and numerous reform-minded clergy had exposed the inhumanity of slavery, mobilizing public opinion, shaping political debates, and compelling religious authorities to reconsider the ethical implications of their silence and complicity. Their tireless advocacy highlighted the essential truth that moral leadership is measured not only by the doctrines it proclaims, but by the actions it takes in the face of injustice. The legacy of the Church's prior inaction continues to reverberate into the present day. Modern discussions about social justice, racial equality, and reparative ethics often grapple with the historical reality that powerful institutions, faith-based or otherwise, have sometimes prioritized stability, wealth, and influence over moral responsibility. The centuries of silence and passive endorsement of slavery serve as a stark reminder that ethical teachings, no matter how eloquently stated, are insufficient without active implementation and courageous confrontation of societal wrongs. The lessons drawn from this period challenge contemporary leaders, communities, and institutions to reflect critically on how current practices may inadvertently perpetuate inequities. Encouraging vigilance, transparency, and a proactive stance in promoting justice. Equally important, the Church's eventual denunciation of slavery underscores the transformative potential of moral reflection. While delayed, this act of acknowledgement illustrates that even institutions with long histories of complicity can evolve, adopting perspectives that align more closely with the principles of fairness, human dignity, and compassion. It reminds us that recognition of past wrongs, coupled with deliberate corrective measures, is essential for healing and for fostering trust within communities historically affected by injustice. The process of moral awakening, whether in individuals or institutions, is often gradual, requiring confrontation with uncomfortable truths, an openness to criticism, and the courage to implement meaningful change. In reflecting on the Church's journey from complicity to condemnation, we gain insight into the broader dynamics of ethical responsibility in society. Power, influence, and authority can be wielded either to perpetuate harm or to advance justice, and the choices made by institutions leave enduring legacies. The narrative of the Church and slavery serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of hope. It warns of the dangers of inaction in the face of injustice, yet it also affirms the human capacity for reflection, moral growth, and the pursuit of a more equitable world. As we consider these historical truths, it becomes evident that moral accountability is not a static or optional attribute, but an active, ongoing process. It requires acknowledging failures, addressing structural inequities, and ensuring that principles of human dignity are translated into concrete actions. In the contemporary context, this reflection encourages faith communities and broader society alike to actively engage in conversations about equality, inclusion, and reparative justice, ensuring that history's lessons inform current and future policies, attitudes, and practices. By facing the past with honesty and courage, we not only honor the memory of those who suffered under unjust systems, but also strengthen our collective capacity to resist injustice wherever it arises. The story of the Church's role in slavery, its delayed condemnation, and the eventual emergence of a more morally conscious stance is a powerful testament to the enduring need for vigilance, ethical reflection, and courage in confronting wrongdoing. It reminds us that the journey toward justice is ongoing and that the path to moral integrity often involves grappling with difficult truths. Accepting responsibility and committing to continuous improvement. By learning from history, we are better equipped to foster communities and institutions that prioritize human dignity, equality, and compassion, ensuring that past mistakes are not repeated and that the voices of those who were historically silenced are honored. Thank you for watching and taking the time to reflect on this challenging yet essential chapter of history. If this video has provided insight or inspired you to think critically about the intersections of faith, morality, and social justice, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel so we can continue exploring these important narratives together. Your engagement helps amplify the voices of history and encourages deeper understanding of the complexities that shape our world. From all of us here, we wish you a thoughtful evening and a restful night. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with reflection, learning, and hope for a more just future.